Beneath the sandstone alcoves of southwestern Colorado sits a puzzle that professional archaeologists still can't fully solve. And it has nothing to do with secret chambers or lost civilizations. It's simpler than that, and somehow far stranger. Sometime around the year 1280, tens of thousands of people who had lived on this landscape for more than 7 centuries packed up, walked away from some of the most sophisticated architecture in North America and never came back. They didn't leave because of war. They didn't leave because of famine alone. And when the land eventually recovered, when the rains returned and the soil could grow corn again, nobody returned to reclaim it. That absence, that total and permanent departure from a place their ancestors had called home since roughly the 1st century CE, is one of the most genuinely unresolved questions in American archaeology, and the closer you look at it, the less it resembles a simple story of drought and hardship. Mesa Verde means green table in Spanish, and the name fits the landscape but not the difficulty of living on it. The mesa sits at roughly 7,000 feet in elevation, a high desert plateau cut through by deep canyons, where annual precipitation hovers around 18 inches, and most of that falls as winter snow. For people who depended almost entirely on rain-fed corn, beans, and squash, that kind of environment left almost no room for error. And yet the people who lived here didn't just survive. They built some of the most architecturally ambitious dwellings in pre-contact Americas, tucked into cliff alcoves where sunlight, wind, and defensibility could all be calculated with precision. Cliff Palace alone contains around 150 rooms and more than 20 kivas, built into a natural sandstone hollow that required generations of accumulated knowledge about masonry, structural loads, and the behavior of the rock itself. This wasn't improvised shelter. This was engineering. And nowhere is that engineering more striking or more genuinely surprising to the archaeologists who uncovered it than in how these communities solved the problem of water. For most of the 20th century, several large depressions scattered across the mesa top were treated as minor curiosities. One of them, a broad circular basin near Farview, had been nicknamed Mummy Lake, and archaeologists spent decades debating what it actually was. Some guessed it was a ceremonial dance floor. Others thought it might be the remnant of a natural sinkhole. In the late 1990s, a Denver-based water engineer named Kenneth Wright, who had previously studied ancient hydraulic systems at Machu Picchu in Peru, was brought in to take a fresh look. Wright and a multidisciplinary team of engineers, archaeologists, and soil scientists spent years cutting trenches, drilling test holes, and analyzing sediment layers across 4 major mound features at Mesa Verde, including Moorfield Box Elder and what became known as the Farview Reservoir. What they found overturned decades of assumptions. These weren't natural depressions, and they weren't ceremonial spaces. They were reservoirs, purpose-built to capture and store water in a landscape that offered almost nothing for free. The Moorfield Reservoir turned out to be especially remarkable. Wright's analysis showed that ancestral Puebloan engineers had converted a section of an intermittent streambed into a functioning water storage basin, and that it remained watertight for roughly 350 years, surviving at least 14 recorded forest fires and 21 major flood events during that span. The reason it held water at all came down to the builders' understanding of local clay. They deliberately used a dense, low-permeability clay that modern engineers would recognize as suitable for lining a landfill to prevent leakage. That is not a detail you stumble into by accident. It requires observing how different soils behave over time, testing what holds water and what lets it seep away, and applying that knowledge consistently across a structure meant to last for centuries. The Farview Reservoir tells a similar story. Recent hydrological modeling, published in Continued Research building on Wright's original findings, indicates that even with rooftop rainwater collection, the surrounding communities still needed additional stored water to meet basic domestic needs, which means the reservoir wasn't a luxury or a ritual space. It was infrastructure sized and engineered for survival of a specific population. In 2004, the American Society of Civil Engineers formally recognized the Mesa Verde reservoir systems as National Historic Civil Engineering Landmarks, placing ancestral Puebloan water engineering in the same category of recognition as some of the country's most significant modern infrastructure projects. What makes this discovery worth sitting with isn't just the cleverness of the design. It's what it reveals about how easily we underestimate the people who came before us. For most of Mesa Verde's history as a national park, Established in 1906, visitors and researchers alike walked past these mounds assuming they were geological features or, at best, minor cultural curiosities. It took a specialist trained in ancient hydraulic engineering, someone who had already seen comparable ingenuity in the Andes, to recognize that the mesa top held a deliberately engineered water system hiding in plain sight. That's a pattern worth remembering, not because it means something more dramatic is buried beneath the ground, but because it shows how much of the real story can sit unrecognized simply because nobody had the right frame of reference to see it. The engineering only makes the central mystery more difficult to explain. If the people of Mesa Verde had solved water scarcity well enough to survive severe multi-decade droughts before, why did they leave for good during this particular one? Tree ring dating, a technique pioneered in the Southwest and refined over nearly a century, gives archaeologists an extraordinarily precise chronology here. By matching the growth ring patterns in construction timbers to a master calendar built from thousands of samples, researchers can date many of Mesa Verde's structures down to the exact year. That precision shows that construction activity slowed dramatically after about 1200, and that longhouse, one of the last major cliff dwellings, was completed around 1280, right as the broader exodus was already underway. The most severe climatic event in this window is what archaeologists call the Great Drought, a period of significantly reduced rainfall that lasted from 1276 to 1299. 23 consecutive years of poor growing conditions would have devastated a population that depended on rain-fed maize, and estimates suggest that potential harvests in this region could swing by more than half depending on rainfall in a given year. For a society already living close to its agricultural limits, that kind of prolonged shortfall is catastrophic. But drought alone doesn't close the case, and archaeologists studying this period are unusually candid about that. The Mesa Verde region had weathered comparably severe droughts before, without triggering a permanent, total abandonment. Something else had changed by the late 1200s that made this drought different. Population had grown substantially, with estimates of the wider Mesa Verde region running as high as 19 to 30,000 people at the peak, a density that put enormous strain on the surrounding land, depleting nearby timber, arable soil, and wild food sources faster than they could recover. Archaeological evidence from this period also points to rising social and political tension, including signs of violence and defensive architecture, along with what researchers describe as religious upheaval and disruption to the trade and exchange networks that had connected communities across the region for generations. According to researchers at the Colorado Encyclopedia and elsewhere, these social pressures appear to predate the worst of the drought years, suggesting that Mesa Verde's communities were already under strain before the climate delivered what many describe as a final blow. In other words, the departure wasn't caused by one thing. It was a layering of multiple crises, environmental, agricultural, social, and spiritual, arriving together at a moment when the margin for recovery had already worn dangerously thin. And still, the deepest part of the mystery isn't why people left. It's why they never returned. Archaeological evidence suggests the migration wasn't a chaotic flight. People appear to have left in a planned, gradual way, over a period of years rather than in a single mass evacuation, as though many communities intended the departure to be temporary. Yet even after the drought broke and conditions on the mesa improved, nobody resettled it in any lasting way. That single fact has pushed some researchers to look past climate and agriculture entirely and toward explanations rooted in religion and worldview, the idea that something about this specific place, in this specific era, had become spiritually unsuitable for continued habitation, regardless of whether the land itself could physically support life again. One of the more remarkable developments in recent decades has been the ability to actually trace where these communities went. Genetic research led by archaeologist Scott Ortman, published in the journal PLOS One and covered by researchers at the University of Colorado, examined ancient DNA and even the genetic lineage of domesticated turkeys, animals that travel with their human communities, to track population movement out of the Mesa Verde region. The evidence points strongly toward a large-scale migration south into the northern Rio Grande Valley of present-day New Mexico, where the descendants of these migrants appear to have become part of the foundation of the modern Tewa-speaking Pueblo communities. This isn't speculation built on guesswork. It connects biological evidence, linguistic patterns, oral tradition, and material culture into a single coherent picture. The people who built Cliff Palace and engineered the Moorfield Reservoir did not vanish. They walked south, carried their knowledge, their traditions, and eventually their communities forward into the present day. And their descendants are still here, still practicing traditions that trace directly back to this mesa. That continuity matters enormously when you consider what the kivas at Mesa Verde still hold. In the floor of nearly every traditional kiva, the round ceremonial chambers built throughout these communities, there is a small hole known as Sapapu. Within Hopi tradition and related belief systems among other Pueblo peoples, the Sapapu represents a place of emergence, the symbolic point through which humanity first climbed up into the present world from the worlds below. It is not a decorative flourish. It is a deliberate architectural feature, repeated in kiva after kiva across centuries of construction, that encodes a core piece of cosmology directly into the built environment. For descendant Pueblo communities today, that symbolism isn't a historical curiosity confined to interpretive plaques. It remains part of a living spiritual tradition, carried forward by people whose ancestors are the same builders who once managed water on this mesa with such precision. Modern Pueblo nations, including Hopi, Zuni, and Acoma among others, maintain recognized cultural and consultative ties to Mesa Verde today, and any research conducted at the park now involves that relationship as a matter of both law and basic respect. What makes Mesa Verde such a compelling case isn't a hidden network of impossible tunnels or an unexplained civilization erased from record. It's the fact that even after more than a century of meticulous excavation, cataloging, and study at one of the most visited and most thoroughly documented archaeological sites in the country, the central questions, why people left when they did, and why they never came back, remain genuinely open. Kenneth Wright's reservoir research didn't uncover conspiracy. It uncovered something arguably more impressive. Proof that society living at the edge of what a harsh environment could support had engineered solutions sophisticated enough to earn recognition alongside modern civil engineering landmarks, and had done so using nothing but observation, trial, and generations of accumulated expertise. The Triering chronology doesn't point to a hidden pre-Puebloan culture. It gives us a startlingly precise record of exactly when construction slowed, when it stopped, and how tightly that timeline lines up with a documented multi-decade drought layered on top of population pressure and social strain. 500,000 people walk through Mesa Verde every year, admiring cliff dwellings that took generations of accumulated skill to design and build. Most of them never noticed the reservoirs, and most never learned that the story of why this place was abandoned is still, honestly, unfinished. Archaeologists have narrowed the causes down to an interlocking set of pressures: drought, resource depletion, overcrowding, and social and religious upheaval. But they have not settled on a single, complete explanation for why an entire population walked away from 350 years of hard-won infrastructure and never looked back. Sometimes the most compelling mystery isn't the one built on speculation. It's the one built entirely on evidence, where the facts are solid, the timeline is precise, and the central human question, why did they truly leave for good, still doesn't have a final answer.